I want to welcome people to this webinar, a webinar discussion of Susan Rotman's book, In Pursuit of Belonging, Forging an Ethical Life in European Turkish Spaces. This is a very exciting event. My name is Myra Marks Ferry, and I have the pleasure with Katrin Zippel of hosting this session on behalf of the Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies at Harvard University. Katrin and I share the overall coordination of the workshop on inclusion and exclusion within this European Studies Center, along with Jonathan Meis and Michelle Lamont, who unfortunately can't attend today. Today, I'm going to be doing the introductions of our speakers and the timekeeping to make sure that we're leaving plenty of time for discussion of both Susan's book and of the overall understanding that she offers of how migration and return migration operate to shape individuals' sense of what is culturally right and wrong. We'll give Susan the time first to provide you all with an overview of the book. So she'll talk for about 15 minutes up front, and then we'll have some shorter comments from the three eminent international scholars who have agreed to share some of their thoughts about the book itself and about its arguments about the meaning of transnational life and life stories. We encourage you to post your own comments and questions into the Q&A function. Rather than the chat function, the Q&A will be monitored all the time. Post anything into the Q&A as ideas occur to you, comments or questions. We usually will not stop to answer anything one-on-one, and the speakers will not be monitoring the Q&A. But Katrin will be monitoring the Q&A for us. So if there is an urgent question of clarification, she can jump in and bring it to our immediate attention. But after about 45 minutes, we will turn to your input, and Katrin will bring in your comments in the Q&A to help steer a more inclusive discussion and give you the reins to guide further considerations among our panelists. Let me begin by introducing them all in the order in which they will speak. Susan Beth Rotman is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Öcalan University. In addition, that's in Istanbul. In addition to the wonderful book we're going to be discussing, she recently finished research on gender and belonging for migrants between Syria, Turkey, and Europe as a primary investigator on the EU Horizon 2020 project, Respond, multi-level governance of mass migration in Europe and beyond. Her publications on Syrian migration have appeared in Critical Sociology, the Journal of Refugee Studies, and Migration Studies. She's also a co-author of 2 books on the topic, and the most recent one is Temporariness, Complexity, and Agency, Reception, Protection, and Integration of Syrians in Turkey. Anna Lund is a professor of sociology and deputy head of the department at the Department of Sociology in Stockholm University. Cultural sociological perspectives and ethnographic methods characterize her research, as well as theoretical concern with social change and cultural transformation under conditions of adversity. Her current research is connected to how models of incorporation are performed in school settings among and for migrant students, as well as in Swedish children's theater. She employs civil society theory and intersectional perspectives at the micro level. She edited the book, The Nordic Civil Sphere, with Jeffrey Alexander and Andrea Voyer in 2019. Gökçe Yurikol is the Georg Simmel Professor of Diversity and Social Conflict at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and the chair of the Department of Foundations of Migration Research at the Berlin Institute of Migration and Integration Research. She was a visiting scholar at Harvard at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs in spring of 2019, where she was affiliated with the Comparative Inequalities and Inclusion Research Cluster. She's published books and articles on immigrant integration, citizenship, Islam in Europe, and issues of Muslim women in Western Europe. and North America. Her most recent book is The Headscarf Debates, Conflict in National Narratives, which came out in 2014 and is co-authored with Anna Korteweg. Jordical and Korteweg have started a new book-length project on media representations of European women who joined ISIS. Maya Sharad is an award-winning author, an associate professor of sociology at the University of Texas, Austin, and a non-resident fellow at the Baker Institute at Rice University. Her book, States and Women's Rights, The Making of Post-Colonial Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, received several awards, including the Best Book in Sociology Award from ASA, and that's the American Sociological Association, and the Best Book on Politics and History, Greenstone Award from the American Political Science Association. Maya has pioneered the study of how strategies of state building in kin-based societies affect women's rights, and she's now working on a new book about feminist resistance to autocracy in Tunisia. So I'm really, really happy to have such an eminent group of people, and I'm very happy to begin this session with a recap of a wonderful book. And I'm just going to hold it up for people to see. In Pursuit of Belonging. Goche has her copy up too. All right, and turn it over to Susan at this point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for coming together for this talk about my book. I'm really excited and honored. Thank you, Myra and Catherine, and also Carrie from Harvard especially. But also thank you to all the discussants that we'll be talking with. I'm very looking forward to this conversation. My comments are going to be based on the book and research that I have completed, but I'm hoping that we can also go beyond and kind of draw out some broader themes and specific points beyond just this research. So the questions that I want to raise are, first of all, how does migration to Europe affect Turkish women's ethical values? More specifically, does transnational movement result in some type of liberation or a reinforcement of traditional norms of belonging? And even beyond this, what are the political and moral implications for feminists writing about Muslim women's agency and feminism? Secondly, how do people in Turkey reflect on belonging in Europe? And in this case, I'm not just interested in the image of Europe, but what it tells us about Turkey's own identity and understanding of its culture, its future, its place in the world. And lastly, how can social scientists study migration from a broader perspective? Here, I'm interested in how we can understand migration as an important social process in people's lives, but also with the understanding that they are embedded in other processes, and it's one thing that happens, and we need to understand how migration affects and has those effects over time or not in particular cases. So the way that I am answering these questions is through an ethnography in the book of a German-Turkish returned migrant woman who I call Layla. So I'm presuming that everyone has some kind of basic understanding of the situation of Turkish migration to Germany after World War II as guest workers and later settlement, and then some have decided to come back to Turkey. So I'm looking at people who come back. I did more than 50 interviews and long-term field work, but I've decided to write the story or tell the story of returning through one person's story, through Layla's story. And I was able to, at the same time, she was also writing her own memoir. So I was able to kind of have a collaborative life writing project with her where I was writing her life while she was also writing her life, and we could use the two to kind of talk to each other. What you see here on the screen are the chapter titles, and they're basically the kind of classic anthropological topics of work, family, marriage, community, religion. But I'm not that I take those as exactly as a kind of structural positions, but more just as sort of topics that I'm looking at. In terms of what I mean when I say migration and women's ethical values, so I'm interested in what the anthropology of ethics has tried to do to understand how people try to be good, to make a good life, to do what they think is right, and at the same time to be accepted in a community. And there's not just one community, and there's not just one idea of what's good or right in any community. So it's kind of like how people work on themselves and also work on their community at the same time in a kind of interactive process to achieve some kind of belonging. And in the book, I look at 3 key ethical projects related to education, gender, and Islam. Within each of those, I'm interested in how there can be shared and divergent ideas in Germany and Turkey about how to be an ethical person related to these areas and depending on the position of the speaker. So with education, I'm interested in when people say things like, I read, I teach my kids, I tell other people what to do, people come to me to ask me questions, I know what I'm doing because I've seen Europe or because I've seen this or because I've had that experience. So it's a work on this sort of self-cultivation, it's a kind of way of improving one's community and also being a good mother. And here, I think there's a lot that's shared. Education is a high value in both Germany and Turkey. So there's not a sense of, it's not an ethical conflict necessarily. By speaking about being educated, you can get sort of prestige or a sense of belonging or community in both contexts, and both contexts kind of work together. In terms of gender, I'm talking about the aim to be a good woman, a good mother, a good wife. So whatever the different ideals or norms are in the different societies. And here I'm particularly interested in sources of shame and violence. So my narrator has experienced sexual violence inside being mother of a disabled daughter, a teenage daughter who is maybe going to be taking some risks. So she has to kind of negotiate these different things that could be sources of shame or could be sources of difficulty or challenges. What I see is that she makes different decisions at different times and in different ways, and it's not just one decision or not just one thing that she's following. So when it comes to being a mother of a disabled child, she is very proud that she is willing to spend a lot of time and energy educating her child and bringing her around and learning more about that topic. But when it comes to her other daughter's honor and certain issues with that, she's much more concerned about what the community would say. In contrast to the education as an ethical project, I think when it comes to gender, there's a more different project in Turkish and German context in terms of understanding women's independent roles, hospitality, honor, these types of things. But there are also a lot of contradictions and differences within both Turkey and Germany. So there's not just one or another, but there's kind of she has to negotiate between these different milieus and make some different decisions there. And with Islam, I'm interested in this idea of leading a respectable Muslim life, and I'm not so much concerned with Germany and Turkey as kind of social context as much as how her relationship to Islam changes over time depending on whether she lives in Germany, returns to Turkey, and other things that happen in her life. It changes her perspective. So in all of these, we can see her working with different ideas about what it means to be educated, to be a good woman, and to be a respectable Muslim in Turkey, in Germany, and somehow in between the two. So what I basically am arguing is that if we want to think about women's agency and the choices that they can make, in a migration context, we have to see that they are able to, or are looking to both uphold community values while also meeting their own needs for autonomy, fulfillment, respect, and esteem. So migration is neither liberating nor reinforcing of pre-existing values. Women can draw on awareness of both life worlds that enable them to act in novel ways. And she even, Layla even says this in her memoir. In some sense, she talks how she's, we are human, we are flawed, no matter what, we will keep making mistakes. I will strive to lead a peaceful and fulfilling life with my husband and children. Despite the bleeding wounds within my soul, I succeeded. So she even sees herself as making a series of decisions and choices and finding some success. So to broaden this out beyond just the case of Layla, what do I mean by expanding choices in the migration context? In the book, I talk a little bit about it in the context of race or colonialism, a type of double consciousness or plurality of vision that minority or oppressed groups might have. But I've recently been reading Anna who's here, and others who are writing about new landscapes of meaning that migration might give, or a wider set of experiences to draw inspiration. I think these are interesting ways of kind of thinking about what changes migration might offer. I mean, we should be careful not to be overly positive about the some kind of opportunities or choices, but at the same time recognize that this maybe opens up different ways of being that might be exciting for people to experiment with. So for the next question, in terms of belonging in Turkey, so a lot of research has shown how migrants come to symbolize the struggles of their nations in different ways. And so we can look at what migrants experience as a way of understanding what is going on in the broader political, economic, social context. So in the case of Turkey, we have a transnational European space that is partly created by Turkey's long, hundreds of years of connections to Europe, political, economic, and social connections, and also the specific history of German-Turkish migration, which gives people a particular orientation or way of thinking about their identity. And one of the questions that I was very interested in the book as I started my research was whether this debate about Turkey's belonging in Europe is over, because it started to seem in the last 10 years or so that the question of Turkey's belonging in Europe has kind of been answered as no, or as like Turkey doesn't want to belong in Europe anymore. Turkey wants to be, it's a leader in the Middle East, and drawing on its Ottoman heritage, and therefore this question about European is not really a potent or important question. In my research, I think we can see, I'll say also in my research and also having lived in Turkey, I think Europe is still quite important in terms of a way of prompting different kinds of discourses and concerns that people share. So you hear people saying certain things about German Turks, and you hear German Turks saying certain things about how they are because of having seen Europe. And so you kind of get the sense that there are some kind of anxieties and longing for belonging in Europe that is kind of, concern about, excessive individualism and freedom, and the need to protect identity and culture and tradition. And how are we going to negotiate those? And how are we going to be modern, but still celebrate who we are? And I think you could argue that with the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis that's happening in Turkey right now, if anyone knows about it, that the question of Europe maybe is, again, it's on the back burner because we have some other pressing concerns. But I would argue that the question of Europe is actually just a stand-in for the question of who are we and what are we? So the broader question of national identity in a really polarized context. So what does it, what does it mean for us to be modern and appreciate our culture in Turkey? I think is still a valid question, whether we answer that in relation to Europe or in general. And so the last point, just looking at migration in a little bit of a broader perspective here, I'm interested in, I mean, people have about how it's important to focus on these transnational spaces and fields, not only the ties and movements that people make. So the narrator that I focus on, Leyla, returned to Turkey many years ago, and she wasn't in Germany as long as some other people. So instead of thinking in these terms of like, I'm a migrant, no, I'm not a migrant, how people go in and out of the identity, I think it's interesting to look at how people engage transnationally at different times over their life, whether they, because of their career, because of what their husband does for a living, because of relatives. It's not only specific ties or movements. I think return migration can be a really good way to decenter migration in migrants' lives, because we have the idea that they go back and they take up their, previous life or identity. But when we study return migrants, we see how things have changed and how they might continue to change. And that's, I think, doing some kind of long-term research. And for me, doing collaborative research has really been useful to see how, especially, for example, the topic of marriage, to see how she or how a person conceives of their own life and experiences versus how I am interpreting it, and being able to put those together and see both is very useful. So I think this kind of like long-term and collaborative methodology could be really good for migration studies and also beyond. So as just a last comment, so I mean, one of the broader implications that I want to make is that migration creates some kinds of ethical options. So some kinds of opportunities for belonging and also challenges to belonging. And the relevance of this, that this is not only a issue for the migrant, but it is also something that society needs to wrestle with. So if we know that migrants are in this situation in different contexts, we can also think about how different societies maybe can approach migrants with an idea that these are maybe what's happening for them. Now, also since the book, as Myra mentioned in the introduction, I've been researching Syrian migration to Turkey. I've also been teaching about belonging, which has been really interesting with undergraduate students. And I've also been living in Turkey for 14 years. And that's me under the red cloth. And so these questions of belonging are very personal to me, as well as intellectual. I feel more and more that I'm realizing how being here is changing my ethical perceptions and ways of thinking about things. I guess the broader question that I want to pose is, we live in rather uncertain times. There's a lot of political volatility. There's a lot of polarization. There's still a pandemic going on. So to what extent does this kind of context, does a kind of upheaval in society lead to different opportunities and challenges for ethics and belonging more broadly for all of us, or for non-migrants? So, while it's clear that migrants are experiencing a certain type of upheaval, maybe there is a broader type of upheaval that we could think about its effects. I'm curious what you think about that. So I think that's, I'll end my comments there and look forward to discussing further.
Thank you very much, Susan, for this presentation. And before I start my comments, I would also like to say a couple of words of praise for this book that you have written, because it's truly a wonderful book. It's nuanced, it's well written, you read it as a novel, and you also weave together the micro and the macro dimensions in a really nice way. And I also think the way you connect previous research to Leila's experience and life story is excellent work. And we get to know Leila's daily life very close, and her encounters with work, education, her struggle to cope with experiences of abuse, of the loss of a child, to handle shame, both connected to be a mother of a disabled child, but also of the suspiciousness that is connected to being a returned migrant. And still, she is able to work on herself, to work for betterment of others, to educate her neighbors and her husband, and being this strong support for her own children. And what is also nice with In Pursuit of Belonging is that Susan is not only interested in vertical relations, as many social scientists are, but you also highlight the possibility of horizontal relationship and solidarity, and show how claims of justice and the struggle for an ethical life on a micro level can look like. So this is a much needed book, I would say, in current times. And you also had this slide of the uncertainty we are living through. Because when I read the book, it's not an easy read. It's an easy read because you can read it like a novel, but you get upset when you read it, sad, angry, but also hopeful. And Leila, who is the main character of the book, is carrying hope to us reader. So the book is also bringing hope to us that reads it. And Leila is simultaneously working with this deep understanding of herself, and also, as I said, this betterment for others. And when I read about Leila's life and also Susan's analysis of her life, I started to think about a quote from Sartre that I think is like symbolizing what this book is doing. And the quote is, "We are not lumps of clay. And what is important is not what people make of us, but what we ourselves make of what they have made of us." So this is like the agents in relation to these different landscapes of meaning and the structures and the gender orders that she is constantly negotiating while working for this ongoing project of belonging and the right ethical choices. And I have a couple of topics in my comments and questions that we will also have the possibility to discuss in the panel. And some of the topics are on methods and on gender and power, and also your theoretical contribution, as well as potential for social change. And of course, methods is always of interest. And when I read the book, I think it's so unique how close you and Leila get to each other. You are important to her, but she is also very important to you. And you get to know a lot about her life, and we see that through the book. But I was thinking through the years, she also probably get to know a lot about your life, about your sad moments, happy moments, your ethical dilemmas, your personal questions connecting to belonging, as you said in your presentation. So I was thinking, like, if you got like this question from, it's a new qualitative method books is on its way, and you have the mission to write a method chapter. And this chapter should be about the quality of this close relationship for getting to the analysis of belonging, ethics, and agency. So what do you gain from becoming friend with a person you actually then analyze the life history of? And are there also things that you actually might lose as a social scientist getting that close? And so that was my method question. When it comes to gender and power in the book, we can read that her way of lived ethical choices is in a constant dialogue with gendered norms connected to a patriarchal order. And she actually needs her family, her husband, and successful children to be culturally approved and respected in the community, in the neighborhood. And this is also conditioning certain dimensions of her work of belonging. And at the same time, there is this feeling then of agency that we can find in when Leila talks about her life. She had this possibility to utilize these different landscapes of meaning or ethical discourses of womanhood and parenthood, and to educate not only herself, but also her husband and her neighbors. But in a critical perspective, what would you also say when it comes to this big emotional burden that Leila also must carry, and also other women you have returned migrants that you have interviewed? How are they handling this? So is there an emotional but also a structural price to pay also for this struggle for belonging and to push the boundaries of what kind of woman you can be as a returned migrant? So what cultural borders can be crossed and what borders cannot be crossed? And what power hierarchies are reproduced while being in pursuit of belonging and forging an ethical life in a European Turkish space? And when it comes to your, you have a lot of different contributions, but in the end of the book, you are yourself pointing to the need for asking questions and address questions of agency and structure. And you want to do this without reproducing, and I quote you here, Western conceptions of self, choice, intentions, and individuality, or conversely, emphasizing culture as a static, essentialized trap, end quote. And you also say then that we need to re-theorize agency. What is it? And your suggestion is that we should link ethics, ethical choices, with belonging. That would make us be a better theorist of understanding what is going on. But this is something I would like a little bit of clarification and development on. Like, what would you say is your main theoretical contribution concerning agency that you want us readers to take from your book? And another thing, I think I'm keeping up time a little bit more, two more questions. And one is such an interesting thing on education, that you actually also bring education in as a possible road for change. And is because education is something that bridges like German and Turkish values that people are like, what do you say, they find consensus around. And this is also, or this is also a road to what do you say, renegotiate gender. So is it also like a possibility that going through education is also, because it's not that connected to gender orders, to honor culture in the same way as other dimensions of the life? Is that also why it can be used as a way of educational practice to also influence gender changes in relation to gender? So education is less dangerous. It's more like something that you can work with. And then my last comment is about what we also can take from your work when it comes to potential for social change. Because you ask yourself in the introduction, what is the best way to create a caring, inclusive, and accepting multicultural society? And then I'm wondering how you would reason in relation to this today, in relation to your own analysis. What would Leila's story and her gradual struggles to change the terms of womanhood, how could that be broadened? How could that be brought to and as an ethical project that could influence society overall? And in relation to that, in such a process, how important is also material repair? Because as you also show in the book, there is also ethical dilemmas connected to poverty, to live in a small house with a lot of children, for when it comes to the children's possibility to do their homework and so on. So there's also this question of actually cultural change, but also relation, how does that relate to the material conditions they live with? And also, before I end, I'm a little bit curious, and I don't really know, and I know too little about feminist academic projects in Turkey, but is there also a possibility of connecting return migrant women as Leila and her struggle for change with academic feminist projects in Turkey? Would there be an understanding, or are there gaps of understanding? So that's all from me at the moment. Thank you for letting me read your book in this context.
Thank you so much. Those were amazing questions and comments. Should I respond
No,
now?
let's go straight to Gökçe.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for giving me the chance to be here today. Mayra, Catherine, and Susan. I had the great chance to meet her last year, actually in November in Istanbul, and discuss the book in person. And I'm seeing some students, some former colleagues in the chat. That's amazing to what digital world can bring to us. Thank you. I read this book as a personal story because I am an immigrant the other way around, from Turkey to Germany. So a lot of things that's written in the book resonated with me in a really deep way. And it's I really recommend for the people who haven't had a chance to read the book to read it, especially if they're interested in transnational migration, intersectionality, questions of ethics and belonging. So my comments will be a little bit more personal and a little bit more related to the politics in Turkey and how this book can contribute to our overall discussions in the German-Turkish transnational spaces. First of all, this is a really unique book, and the fieldwork is really intense, and it's so insightful. It's about the temporality of ethics and ethical pluralities with a deep analysis of belonging in the transnational migration. I have never seen any book like this, and I assume that I know this literature quite well. And this theorizing of belonging is especially really missing in the literature. The operationalization of belonging is missing in the literature. So it's actually fulfilling an important gap, especially in the transnational spaces. And what I really like is that it looks beyond identity and identity politics and theorizes the broader question of ethics in migration spaces. So in the sense, this rich field work in controversial spaces that immigrants negotiate their belonging and question about what is an ethical life from an intersectional perspective, from an immigrant, working class woman's eyes. So first, when I got the book first, I went through it and I'm like, okay, again, honor, again, circumcision, again, forced marriage, again. And then And then, but when I actually got into it, because these are all the subjects that we always study, you know, honor, forced marriage, circumcision. But when I started reading it, it's so insightful and it's so beyond the, it's very unusual how, and very insightful how Susan deals with these actually mundane questions. What I really liked is the call centers, because, you know, I get to them rarely in the literature. So how she negotiate the ethics of the call center was very interesting to read, and it's novel. And as I said, you know, one of the challenges is the ethics of actually, it's very difficult to operationalize in practice. And on page 9, for example, Susan differentiates between ethics and morality. This was also one of my questions, you know, is this ethics or is it morality? And places ethics as a toolkit about how to be a good person. So we see in Leila's life story that she experiences ethical dilemmas through her plural belongings. And this really resonated with me. When we see the call center circumcision ceremony in what is called Kabul Günü, the women's reception day, you know, all these things that reminded me of Turkey, and her views of about the governing party, the AKP. And that's where I want to stop for a minute, because one of the questions in these transnational spaces that Leila probably gets, and I get it all the time, is why are the Almancıs voting for AKP in Turkey and the Green Party in Germany? And I find the answer to this question actually in the theorization of the book, because they are negotiating these ethical spaces from their individual backgrounds. And so I wrote this book, Myra kindly mentioned its name, The Headscarf Debates. So the book is quite positive about women who are wearing headscarves. And when people from Turkey come to Germany and tell me, how is this possible? A person like you can write a book about headscarves, so positive about it. And so these are the ethical spaces that we're constantly negotiating in transnational spaces. And here again, you know, I find the answer in my own view, and I would like to actually discuss this with the broader audience. I see a lot of people who are attending from Turkey. Why are they voting for the AKP? Because German Turks have the highest vote of AKP, especially in the last elections. They have the right to vote. Why are they voting for the AKP in Turkey but SPD or the Greens in Germany? Because they are negotiating these ethical spaces in the transnational, these ethics in the transnational spaces between Turkey and Germany. Of course, this brings the age-old question of what does belonging mean? And in a transnational space, in a political point of view, where do they belong? Are they AKP supporters or are they the Green Party supporters? Anyways, I'll come back to Leila. This is the fun part of the book. So Leila strives to belong through her integration, but is constantly challenged because of her, what we call in quote unquote, Almancı background. And her reintegration is never complete. Similar to what Anna Lund just mentioned, one of the questions that I was wondering is the relationship between Susan and Leila, and whether after Leila published this book, whether Leila had after Susan published the book, whether Leila had, her relation with Leila soured or not. Because also there are things that are intimate, or how did Leila look at this and which perspective, and what is the ethics as a researcher to give back to the respondents? So your relationship with Leila, I was curious about it. This is also one question that my students ask me a lot. You know, I'm going to write about it, but is my question, is my relationship with my respondent, is it going to be sour after I publish it? And the other one is the use of diary in research. And so ethnography is usually fieldwork and interviewing, but Susan used diary analysis in addition to these classical ethnographic methods. And this made me very curious. So after I met Susan in Istanbul, I came home in Berlin and I started researching about it, Susan. And I started reading Terry Williams' work from New School, where he analyzed diaries of teens with mental illness. And I want to ask Susan, to further our conversation about the issue, how diary analysis affected her ideas about ethnographic research. What are the difficulties of connecting Leila's diary to fieldwork and interviewing? And what do you think about ethics of diary analysis? So this will be my contribution, and would like to hear Munira. Then I will give it to Munira next.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for organizing, Myra, Catherine, and thank you to Susan for writing this book and for the commentators. I have one slide. I'm going to bring it up, try to, and see if this works. Can you see my screen? Okay, so first of all, I want to say that this is a wonderful book and that I enjoyed reading it so much. It invites the reader into a very compelling story, and it drew me in immediately. I wanted to know from the get-go more about the life of Leila, and as Anna said, it reads like a novel and it's beautifully written. And the book spoke to me as a sociologist and also as someone who has lived a transnational life since I lived in the US, in France, and in the United States. So as I was reading the book, I found myself having the two parts of me responding to the text. And I think also that as a sociologist, the book opens new venues for understanding experiences of migration. I want to outline three themes that I found compelling in the book. The first is the transnational lives, what they're about, what they mean, and how they provide a consciousness of alternatives, to use Susan's terms. The second is the tension between community or individualism, and the third is navigating norms. So let's start with the transnational lives. Susan tells us that migration expands the range of ethical choices that people have in constructing their lives, and that Leila sees possibilities where other people do not. Because of having lived in Germany and Turkey, she sees different ways of relating to others and to her world. She has an expanded range of ideas to draw upon in deciding how to be a wife, a good parent, a friend, a member of her community, and a religious person. So she's in a position to create novel combinations of German and Turkish ideas on hard work, education, and norms of interaction between men and women. So this reminds me a lot of the work of sociologist Anne Swidler from UC Berkeley, who defines culture as a toolkit of strategies for action and not some abstract set of ideas. Rather, culture offers ways of doing things. And we all have our toolkit of possibilities in making decisions. And migration has given Leila a larger toolkit with a greater range of possible strategies for action. So being transnational not only provides a set of alternatives, but also creates dilemmas, because we see in the book how Leila is constantly making and remaking choices as she goes through her lives. So transnational lives can generate a consciousness of alternatives. And here I have a question for Susan, because Leila says at the end of the book, I have been successful. She's happy with her life and she has accomplished much of what she wanted to accomplish. And I think there is a question of methodology, which is inescapable in a way. If we look at an individual life, a sociologist is led to ask how many people are like Leila. She was successful. Are there women like her who are less successful, who are not successful? So it's wonderful that Leila gives us the hope, and we do end reading the book on a very strong note of success in individual life and hope, and that's wonderful. That leads me to ask, however, how about the other side of the coin? Is it there? Is it not there? How do I think about it? Those kinds of questions. And Susan asks us to rethink migration, and I agree wholeheartedly with that. She tells us that migration is usually discussed as a problem. And this book shows, however, that there is another dimension to migration, that being a transnational migrant is not only a problem, causing difficulty, exclusion, and lack of belonging, but it can also open up possible options, and that migrants are exposed to a wide variety of perspectives. So they can make a contribution to their communities by bringing in new ideas and possibly by fostering change. And I'm reminded here of what I have seen in Tunisia, where there is an office that deals with migrants to Europe, and also returned migrants to Tunisia. And somehow the discourse that comes out of that office, or that is the general discourse in the country about returned migrants, is more of migration as a problem. And your book, Susan, shows that it's not always a problem. And in fact, that return migration is rich of possibilities. And the part of me, the sociologist in me, wants this to be better known and wants this to be more integrated into collective action and into policy. There is so much that is rich of possibilities in the story you're telling us, and yet return migration is discussed in so many countries as a terrible problem. What can we do to shift the perspective? Is there any way that stories like Leila's stories can enter the discourse, so at least to enrich it? The second point, the second theme that I find compelling is the one on community or individual, and community or individualism. And here I'm speaking as someone who has worked on the region, on North Africa, not on Turkey. And I think that the question of community versus individual is so central, so salient, so big, so tormenting for people that this is a theme that resonated strongly with me as I read the book. The book shows so well the significance that people place on the acceptance of their neighbors and relatives in certain communities in Turkey. Leila says, everyone cares so much about what others think. They always say, what will people say? And she goes on, in Germany, you live for yourself, but in Turkey, you live for society. Also, as someone who grew up in Tunisia, I heard this from day one. What will people say guides so many decisions that people make about their own lives. So this is big, this is strong, this is something that sometimes people who have not been in those countries or haven't lived there really do not understand the depth of it. And I think your book does a magnificent job in impressing the significance of this dimension in people's lives. So basically in longing for roots and in forging their lives in some communities in Turkey, as in other parts of the Middle East, migrants returning to their home country cannot escape the reality of community presence and community pressure. It is what we call in the study of the region, the care control paradigm. You receive care from others, but others exert control over you. So how do you navigate that? And that salient issue colors a lot of the individual decisions that people make. In some cases, in searching for belonging, whether it is the return migrants to the region or whether it is migrants to Europe, the reality of community versus individual, of live for society or yourself, can lead to ruptures, to disasters. And I am wondering again whether Leila is an extraordinary case or whether she is not. Have you observed ruptures over that issue in your work? I believe that I am close to my time, but I want to indicate the last one, which is navigating norms and how Leila is constantly going from one to the other, German to Turkish norms, and finding her way through. So it's a form of empowerment. And here I join Anna, who was saying that this is a form of empowerment and agency. Are there ways to connect this form of individual agency to some of the collective agency for women's empowerment that is indeed going on in some countries? And I will just conclude with a question. I'm wondering whether you have any sense of men going through similar experiences, because your book raises the question of masculinities in transnational lives, of consciousness of alternative, and strategies for action that might follow from that. And I just want to say that the book opens ways of thinking about migration, about different groups. It's not only about potentially, it's not only about return migrants, it's also about anyone that has a transnational life. How about children of binational marriages? How about many, many other groups? And I think your book also raises the question of who can push the boundaries and under which conditions, what are the boundaries that can be crossed and who can cross them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maya. I want to pass the baton back to Susan, but ask her, even though this is a great range of wonderful questions, to keep her responses relatively short first, so we can bring in the questions from the Q&A also, which are also great questions. And then if there is time, we can return to the questions from the panelists. So Susan, be brief in responding to the panelists, and let's bring some Q&A people in and then respond more to the panelists as time allows.
Okay, I will try. I mean, these were such amazing comments, and I mean, I just love this discussion. I wish it would last for hours, but probably other people are not as eager for it to last forever. But I guess there are some questions that I want to answer. There are some questions that I wish we could turn over to a more open discussion with the audience and the panelists, because I think they are questions that we can really all wrestle with, or based on our different perspectives. But the first, I guess, methods came up in almost all of the panelists' comments, and I think that's a very important question. So in terms of my relationship to Layla and how unique she is, I think are two kind of key questions that need to be kind of thought about how this could be applicable in other case, or as Anna Lund said, like if we were to write a methods textbook, you know, what would you tell people about how you're supposed to find somebody or how you're supposed to do field work? I actually think these are incredibly important questions. And not that I necessarily have the answer. I think the issue is not so much the ethics of, I mean, I didn't have a bad experience of after writing the book with Layla, like the ethics of telling a person's story, I think is not, I think that's been written about a lot as ethically dangerous, because they might not know the purpose to which it's being put, and these types of things. And those are very valid, but I think you can manage it through consent, processes of constantly checking back, and you know, having a very open communication always, and checking at stages. You don't just ask one time, is this okay? You ask about every little thing. You don't just get a blanket like, yeah, you can say whatever you want. You have to keep checking, you know, it's kind of a back and forth. So for me, that's you know, challenging, but that's not the main problem. The main problem is, I think that we really don't know how to do collaboration as academics very well. At least as I was trained as an anthropologist, it was like, I'm going there to get something for her that I will use, and maybe I can do a few things for her. And as I've tried to help her to develop her work, I've realized how ill-equipped I am to do it. I don't know how to teach writing. I don't know that much about publishing besides my own, you know, small forays. And I think friendship is also something that academics haven't really even explored enough. There's a little bit of writing and also in feminist literature about the dangers of friendship in the field, you know, for both the scholar and also for the person who might be, will be disappointed. But I think, I mean, this is another thing that's affected by the times. You know, I'm also thinking, like, what do I owe my friends in different places, different types of friends, different qualities of friendship? What is the ethics of friendship? And in field work, that takes on another, I guess, burden. So I definitely am going to be exploring and writing about that more. And I think that's a very good, those are really important questions. I think the questions about the potential for social change, like some people brought up whether Layla can work with feminists in Turkey or whether return migrants themselves can be a force for social change. I think I would like to see what other panelists or participants think about that topic. I mean, I would also love to know what sociologists who study social movements think. So maybe you know, those of you who do can say more about it. It's very depressing these days. I don't know. I'm skeptical, honestly. I'm not sure, you know, I mean, maybe there are small, minute changes that are happening in communities, and that's what I tried to highlight as Layla's success. But I don't know if we can, you know, how it can tie in, and how feminist movements, this is a discussion I've had with Myra as well, like how do feminist movements, you know, is Layla a feminist, and if so, how would feminists approach her, work with her, incorporate her, or how would she become a leader? So I think that's a very good question. And then if we ask about why returned migrants are supporting AKP instead of Green Party or other parties in Turkey, then we have to ask what kind of politics are returned migrants going to do? I mean, there's so many other things that I could say. Should I keep going maybe, or stop for a second?
Why don't you let Katrin bring in some of the questions from the audience, and I think then you can combine them with some of what the panelists have asked. I think some of them move in similar directions.
Okay.
Terrific. Well, thank you to the audience who have been starting to post questions into the Q&A. That's the best place now for me to move. I know that I asked you earlier to post, you know, where you're from today in the chat, but we're moving now to the Q&A to answer any questions. So if you don't mind using the Q&A, it's open now, and I'm gonna try to organize your questions. But I think one of them was also about methods. And so I thought this would be interesting in terms of, and that's from Odile Heinders. And sorry if I'm mispronouncing your names, but she's asking, what does it mean to read the book as a novel? Does it mean that the reading of a novel is easy or juicy or entertaining? And then how would this writing of the novel be different from academic writing? Or does the novel provide knowledge as an academic writing does? So it's a relationship between novel and writing. And, you know, it would be great if you can tell us about why you chose that kind of, how you came to your writing style.
Yeah, I mean, anthropologists have been fairly experimental with how they have tried to write. And I mean, I think there's kind of an aim to, you know, to sort of communicate something in a way that will be understandable. And if we can do it in a more, you know, with a lot of description and, you know, with a certain readability, it can bring people in. There's even been, I mean, anthropologists have even, you know, written what's the border between fiction and ethnography, in the sense that ethnography is also a kind of portrayal of a certain way of beings, you know, and it's the perception of this, you know, it has a subjective quality to it. So, but just from a personal level, I just really wrote what I wanted to write. I mean, it wasn't that I thought it will only be, this is the type of book that I should write, or, you know, it was the things that really were meaningful as I was thinking about them, to her and to me. So I think that's the answer.
Terrific. And then there's another question about the relationship between identity and belonging in the academic literature. So Kutlai Yagmor is saying, and I'll just read that now, you have excellent insights into identity and identification in your book. You show the multi-layered and complex nature of personal identity. However, when we look at the literature in social sciences, we see categories based on ethnicity, religion, or language, totally ignoring the personal dimension. Scholars make sweeping overgeneralizations based on ethnic identity alone. Based on your impressive study, what would you say about the broad categorization of identity and belonging in academic work?
Okay, this is, thank you for that great question. And I think maybe this is something that also Anna kind of asked in terms of agency and structure. I mean, this gets into that question of, you know, how can we understand people as acting agents, but also within some kind of cultural ideas, but without seeing culture as something that forces them to act in particular ways. And she asked, like, so what do you what do you suggest for this? I mean, I think belonging is one way of going beyond culture as just a set of norms and structures that comes from a certain ethno-national background. At least belonging, it can kind of open us up to, there's belonging in a school, there's belonging in your neighborhood, there's belonging in your family. I mean, there's some students talk about not belonging in their own home. I mean, so there can be a lot of different levels of belonging. So that's one way. I think a lot of complexity and contextual details and research is a really good way to get beneath the things that at first you think it's just, you know, you even as the analyst might label it one way or another as a particular, coming from a particular ethnic or cultural quality. But as you get more information and go a little bit more and see people in different contexts, you kind of understand the different ideas that they're working with and how they're making those negotiations. And I think maybe that kind of is one way of not being in the kind of straitjacket of, you know, seeing things in categories. So I guess that would be, I think that's what I think that's my suggestion, but I think it's an ongoing problem. And I mean, as social theorists, we want to categorize because that's one of the things we want to do and understand. So I'm curious kind of what Myra would say about it, because I think she, I don't know, you know, we have to say things about the social world, but at the same time, without essentializing, and it's not easy.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome answer. I actually have 2 more questions from the audience that I would like to put together because they asked both about, so what does belonging mean? You mentioned, and this is from an anonymous attendee, so when you think about the broader implication of your work, what does belonging mean in these uncertain times? And the audience members said that they really liked that question, and they propose a question and answer that can be a lot of things, such as purpose, a sense of purpose, or realization of self-worth, and asking you, could that be an answer? And they look forward to reading your book. And then Emily Miller is also asking a question about how this concept that you're working with, and how could the concept of transnational migration between places and the problems and perspectives be applied to discussions of transgender people and their lived experience. So I think that's a really also interesting question to think about the belonging and the sort of in-between spaces. I was thinking about Gloria Anzaldúa's borderlands, as well as the feminist concept of what does the sort of in-between and beyond allow for, you know, reconfigurations of ideas. So please go ahead.
Well, I will say that it's my belief that we need a lot more research on belonging. I think that it's kind of interpreted to be a somehow fuzzy concept, or it's just a feeling, but it's not really something that matters. And I think that it can be a really interesting way of understanding things that are really important to the people who are in different contexts. People are often thinking about how they fit in. And so for me, belonging has something to do with that. I think self-worth and purpose are great. If you read there's some psychological literature on belonging, but there really needs to be, I think we could have a lot more. I think it's becoming more. I mean, I'm also reading that there are more people writing about belonging, but instead of giving a specific answer, I would say that if you have the opportunity to research it, it would be great to come up with different models, come up with different ways of operationalizing, explore it in different contexts. I find it a useful category. In the book, I thought of it in terms of ethical relationships. So if you think of it as like, people want to be good and be seen as good, and how do we work that out? How do we work out our image of ourselves? It's kind of like self-image, it's kind of like self-esteem, it's kind of like respect, it's kind of like intersubjectivity. It's some way that we work out with other people who we are, who they are, how we relate to them. That's, I guess, one that was what I worked in that context, but I think it could be, I would just love to read more from other people also writing about the topic. Similarly in terms of thinking about it in terms of transgender issues, that's so interesting. And I would also love to read somebody who was working with some of the same ideas, but in that context, because I think that makes total sense, that would also be, could also be an interesting area to look at what different ethical choices and how people negotiate that based on that experience. So yeah, I don't have research on that, but I like that idea.
Great, and there are many more questions that we probably can't all answer, but I want to give it back to Myra to see if the other panelists might also want to jump in.
Indeed, I think that all of the panelists can unmute and jump in along with Susan. I think Susan's doing a brilliant job of dealing with the questions, and I think they're a great set of questions, but anyone who wants to pick out any questions from the Q&A that they want to connect with what they had to say, or anyone who wants to push Susan a little more to pick up some of the ideas they put out, I think that's just fine at this point.
I could say a couple of words in relation to both the novel and ethnography, because also why I think it reads like a novel, it's also because it translates, I think Andrew Abbott would say, what is happening in Leila's life and another returned migrant's life into a sociological explanation that also is emotional. So we get to understand, you convince us not only with data and previous research, but also with emotions. And I think that's something that is really, really good with your book. And also when it comes to this big question of collective action and to bring the struggles of Leila and other returned migrant women to a broader social context, I'm thinking also that maybe you are actually part of that, Susan. And why I say that is because I think of you as almost like a civil translator or maybe an ethical translator, if you use your words, because you narrate images and stories that really disturb dominant discourses by the nuance picture you are giving. So you start to make the reader see, okay, who we think are them and who are us is not like static categories. They are more arbitrary. And you bring in also the reader by actually talking to us directly. You are asking us to relate to Leila's story, irrespective of our background, to see actually where our existential possibilities to meet and to evaluate our lives in through Leila's lives. And that, I think, is you're doing a job also as then an ethical translator for the audience of creating mutual recognition between her life and my life in Sweden as a professor in Stockholm. I can see that we have similar ethical dilemmas in life. So we become equals rather than separate. And I think that's also a way of seeing how this kind of work can have a broader significance.
If I may also jump in here, two things came to my mind. First of all, with the transgender topic, I feel myself very close to Susan's work because I also worked on Bulgarian Muslim trans immigrants in Germany and how they negotiate their lives and they're also sex workers, how they negotiate Bulgarian, European trans immigrant sex work in Berlin. So that's what we worked about, and I can totally relate to Susan's work here, how they negotiate these transgender spaces. So I wanted to jump into that question about transgender negotiations. And the second one is the question of German Turks. So this has been a question also quite a bit discussed in the literature. Where does the term German Turks come from? I'm reading it from the chat, Ali Said Ilkin. So it comes from the American, Mexican Americans, or I don't know, Colombian Americans. So we started calling them German Turks. But as you will also read in the book, this hyphenated in-betweenness, these two national identities do not work as we are seeing it in the German Turk national identity. And that's why Susan is also talking about, these negotiation of different kinds of transnational spaces. I don't want to call it identity because it really doesn't capture. So according to the Leila is challenged, but also goes with the situation, this transnational space. So German Turk is really not making justice. Like previously, for example, Ayhan Kaya wrote about that. These like plurality of spaces, and it's also a very nourishing, very flourishing space, and that's beyond two national identities coming together. So I don't find this German Turk as an hyphenated identity doing justice to the plurality of their lives. And I think Susan will agree with me because she's nodding.
I totally agree with you, but I guess the question I would like to ask to maybe the audience or the other panelists is, if German Turk had not appeared in the title of this talk, would you have known what it was about? Would you have come, like, how do we, we're trapped in sometimes using terms, even if we don't want to, even if we want to problematize them, just because people know what they mean, So I guess that's my only, as I did write in the book, I didn't say that I was doing research on German Turks. It isn't really a term that's used in Turkey, as far as I know. So it doesn't have relevance here. So, but when I go back into the kind of academic realm, I do find myself using it. So I don't know what are good strategies to avoid that kind of ethnic centrism.
And if I can just add one question from Samrito Kocha. because that really follows it up. So the question is, how is Laila and other participants negotiating their Muslim identities and their gender identities? So how does their sense of both identities converge and or differ in their lived experience in Turkey and in Germany? So how do they relate social cultural boundaries of Muslimness and womanhood in both societies to their particular experiences of both identities?
I mean, I feel like that's such a big question. That's really hard. I guess my answer is that there's not one way, that it's kind of like depends on the situation. And I tried to trace different situations. So in the workplace, there's certain ways of doing gender propriety, and religion didn't seem as relevant in that case, at least where I was doing research. But in the family and home, both are very important in different ways, but she can make, it can have different qualities depending on which child is, of concern, and what the situation is with the family at that time, and what her situation is with the person with whom she's interacting. And also her own feelings are changing over time. And even though I tried to communicate her, her religious transformations were really interesting for me, just as a personally not religious person, but like, why is she describes herself as, wearing a headscarf, being religious after losing her daughter. Then today I see her rarely doing religious things, but then she's fasting, but then she's doing this, she's doing that. So she's making a lot of different, she's going through a lot of different things. And I think this is, what we might all be doing, right, at different times, if and depending on the situation. There's not just one way of doing gender and religion, either for her or for people in Turkey or in Germany either. So it's kind of like, but that doesn't mean, I wouldn't want to take that to them, we can't study it. And we can still look at what people are, what are the decisions that they're making? What are the choices that they have? What do they think is possible? And what do they want in the situation? And how are they trying to manage it? How are they at it? And it can work and not work, and it can be a process over time. So I think if you can capture the process, you can maybe get a lot of insight into the types of debates and difficulties and decisions that people are going through. But it's hard to just isolate it as one thing. But I'd be interested in what other people think about that.
Great, and that's from the chat. And I'm just going to post for the future events from this seminar series, but I'll hand over to Myra to wrap up.
I think Maya had a very quick word before I.
Yeah, I just wanted to address the question of agency, potential empowerment, individual agency like Laila's. And you give us you create some intimate knowledge of what she's going through, what she's doing. And then how does that possibly relate to feminist agency on a more collective level in many countries? It's a very difficult question, but maybe academics can have a little minute contribution to this in even creating linkages. A lot of feminist associations are desperate to reach a broader audience, and they feel, they're often elitist groups, they're stuck in their space, and they want to meet other women. And maybe we can do a tiny little thing by at least letting them know about each other. Small step.
That's great.
Thank you very much.
I hope so.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I knew we needed at least this much time. I'm glad we took the longer thing, and I congratulate the participants who've stayed with us for the whole hour and a half. I think it's wonderful. I'm very, very impressed with the discussion. Katrin has posted the upcoming events that pick up on some of these kinds of questions. I want to thank everyone for bringing their unique and special forms of academic belonging and transnational identities together into this particular space. I think it's been a very fruitful one and a very enjoyable one. And I'm very sad that we have to close it down. Thank you all.
Thank